Tonight, I've gathered some of the darkest and most chilling true horror stories from across the internet. Stories whispered in forgotten forums, buried in late-night Reddit threads, and shared by people who swore they'd never speak of it again. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? Are you lying in bed with the lights off, listening during a midnight drive, or maybe you're just trying to make it through the night shift? Get comfortable, put your headphones in, and whatever you do, don't look behind you. Let's begin. Growing up in a small town had always felt safe. People rarely locked their doors, and neighbors waved to each other while walking their dogs down peaceful streets lined with tidy houses. My family had lived in our modest suburban home for almost my entire life. At 21, after finishing college, I moved back home temporarily, planning to find a job and save money for my own place. But everything changed that summer, turning our quiet, safe neighborhood into something I'd never imagined possible. It began quietly, unnoticed by most. At first, I didn't think twice when my mom mentioned offhandedly that she thought she'd seen someone lingering on our street late at night. Probably just someone out walking, she'd said casually one morning over coffee. But soon, other neighbors started noticing things too. Footsteps heard outside windows, strange cars parked for hours at a time, and even reports of people attempting to open doors in the middle of the night. The incidents became more frequent, and whispers quickly spread throughout the neighborhood. Anxiety crept into conversations. Suddenly, our safe community didn't feel quite so secure. One humid evening in late July, the discomfort that had been building finally became real for us. My parents had gone out to dinner, leaving me home alone. I was relaxing on the couch, aimlessly watching television, when I heard a faint sound at the front door, like someone testing the doorknob gently, carefully turning it. My heart skipped instantly. I muted the TV, holding my breath, listening intently. For several moments, silence filled the house. Just as I convinced myself I'd imagined it, I heard it again, clearer, more insistent. Someone was definitely trying to turn the doorknob. I quietly stood up and tiptoed toward the door, my heart racing. Peering through the peephole, I saw a figure standing on our porch, their face obscured by a hood pulled low over their forehead. I froze, adrenaline surging through me as the person slowly stepped back, scanning the windows methodically. After several tense moments, they finally turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. I immediately called my parents, voice shaking as I explained what had happened. They rushed home and we spent the evening nervously checking locks, securing windows, and discussing whether to report it to the police. Ultimately, we decided it was important enough, and officers came to take our statement. The officer assured us they'd patrol more often, but their presence didn't ease our fears completely. The next morning we learned we weren't alone. Other neighbors reported similar incidents. Someone had attempted to enter their homes as well. Panic swept the neighborhood. Suddenly, locks appeared on gates. Security cameras were installed overnight, and whispered rumors filled every conversation. As days passed, the atmosphere grew tense. Neighbors avoided staying out late, and an eerie silence settled over the neighborhood after dark. Yet despite increased police patrols, the intrusions continued sporadically. Always careful, always quiet. Someone was clearly targeting homes methodically, testing defenses, and learning routines. Our house became quiet and uneasy, with every unfamiliar noise magnified by our fear. One night, weeks after the first incident, things escalated to an entirely different level. My parents had gone to bed, but anxiety kept me awake, scrolling mindlessly on my phone. Suddenly, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A soft creak outside my bedroom window, directly beside my bed. I sat up instantly, straining to hear. Seconds later, the unmistakable sound of quiet breathing filled my ears. Someone stood just inches from me, separated only by thin glass and curtains. Paralyzed with fear, I listened as the breathing continued, slow and steady, accompanied by the subtle scraping sound of fingertips tracing gently along the glass. Back and forth, my heart pounded painfully, mind racing, wondering if the window was locked securely. A horrifying realization set in. Someone wasn't just watching our neighborhood anymore. They were focused directly on us, testing boundaries, and clearly unafraid to take risks. My body was completely frozen as I stared wide-eyed at my window. The gentle scraping sound continued, fingertips gliding across the glass slowly, methodically, almost as if savoring the fear they knew they were causing. The steady breathing just beyond the window was so close that I imagined I could almost feel the intruder's presence seeping through the thin curtain. Every instinct told me to run, scream, or at least wake my parents, but fear held me rooted to the bed. My phone felt impossibly far, resting on my bedside table just inches away. I knew I had to reach for it without alerting whoever stood just beyond the glass. Moving painfully slowly, I stretched my trembling hand, my fingertips barely brushing the edge of my phone. Just as my hand closed around the phone, the scraping stopped. My heart seemed to halt along with it. Absolute silence filled the room, louder and more oppressive than any sound I'd ever heard. Seconds dragged by, feeling impossibly long. Had they sensed my movement? Then, without warning, the figure abruptly stepped back from the window. I heard the crunch of gravel and quiet footsteps fading rapidly into the night. Relief flooded me momentarily, quickly replaced by anxiety. Why had they suddenly retreated? I immediately dialed 911, my voice shaking badly as I whispered what had happened to the dispatcher, terrified the intruder might still be lurking nearby. Officers arrived swiftly, illuminating our home with bright flashlights and scouring the property carefully. After several tense minutes, the police approached my window, examining closely. They found faint, fresh footprints pressed deeply into the soft earth directly outside. Even more chilling, they discovered fingerprints smudged across the glass. Someone had stood there, deliberately pressing their hand against the window, inches from where I slept. That night, sleep was impossible, even with officers patrolling the neighborhood. My parents and I spent the night anxiously awake, jumping at every sound. The house no longer felt safe. It felt invaded, vulnerable. Whoever had been targeting our neighborhood had now specifically targeted me, personally testing the boundaries of my safety. Days passed in tense uncertainty. We installed new locks, security lights, and even motion-sensitive cameras around our house. My dad took to nightly patrols around our property, a baseball bat gripped tightly in his hand. Anxiety permeated every moment. Every evening brought dread. Every sound after dark felt threatening. Yet, despite increased vigilance, the intruder seemed one step ahead, always managing to avoid capture. Reports continued through the neighborhood, footsteps outside bedrooms, shadows lingering at the edges of backyards. Fear tightened its grip. Neighbors banded together more closely, determined yet frustrated by our collective inability to find peace again. Then came a night I'll never forget, one that changed everything. My parents attended an event, leaving me home alone once more. Anxiety clawed at my mind, yet I reassured them repeatedly I'd be safe, hoping I was right. Hours passed quietly enough, tension easing slightly as I busied myself with chores, deliberately avoiding windows and locking every possible entry point. Just as I settled down to relax, however, a sudden noise erupted from the back of the house. A loud, sharp crack, like wood breaking. My pulse skyrocketed. Every instinct screamed danger. Grabbing my phone, I crept cautiously toward the hallway, peering down the darkened corridor toward the source of the sound. My heart nearly stopped entirely. The back door, clearly visible from where I stood, was hanging partially open, broken, forced inward, swaying slightly on damaged hinges. Absolute panic consumed me. As realization struck, the intruder was no longer testing our home. They'd forced their way inside. My blood ran cold as I stared helplessly at the broken back door, realizing someone had finally breached our home. The hallway was dimly lit, shadows stretching ominously into the darkened rooms. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to hide, to call for help, but fear had rooted me firmly in place. Suddenly, from deeper inside the house, I heard footsteps, quiet, deliberate, slow movements that indicated whoever was inside felt no urgency. They were calm, confident, and clearly knew I was home. My heart raced painfully. Every breath felt difficult, as I struggled silently to decide what to do next. I slowly backed away, retreating into the kitchen, my phone shaking violently in my hand. I quickly dialed 911 again, whispering urgently that someone had broken into my home. The dispatcher calmly instructed me to hide quietly and wait for police, reassuring me help was already on the way. But before I could move to find a hiding place, the footsteps began moving toward me, growing louder with each passing second. The intruder was drawing closer, carefully searching room by room. Panic surged through me. I had only moments to act. Without thinking, I quietly ducked into the pantry closet near the kitchen, pulling the door closed and sliding down against the shelves. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried desperately to quiet my frantic breathing. Seconds later, footsteps entered the kitchen, heavy and unmistakably close. Whoever it was moved slowly around, cabinets gently opening and closing, as if carefully examining everything. A moment of silence passed, and then came a low voice, soft, calm and deeply unsettling, whispering quietly into the empty air. "I know you're here. Come out." Chills rushed down my spine, and fear tightened its grip even further. I stayed completely frozen, tears welling up in my eyes, praying the police would arrive soon. But the intruder persisted, walking deliberately, calmly circling the kitchen. Then, horrifyingly, the footsteps stopped directly in front of the pantry door. The shadows from beneath the doorframe darkened as the intruder stood silently, inches away from me, breathing softly. I could feel their presence, their closeness, separated only by a thin wooden door. Seconds stretched endlessly as I fought back tears, my body shaking uncontrollably. I held my breath, convinced they'd hear my heartbeat through the thin barrier. Slowly, gently, the pantry doorknob began to turn. My entire body stiffened, bracing myself for the worst. But at that moment, flashing lights filled the house through the windows, casting frantic patterns across the walls. Sirens erupted in the distance, rapidly growing louder. The intruder released the doorknob instantly, footsteps retreating quickly toward the back door. Moments later, the front door slammed open as officers rushed inside, calling out loudly. I burst from the pantry, nearly collapsing from relief, shouting desperately that the intruder had run toward the backyard. Officers immediately pursued, flooding our property with lights. Minutes passed in agonizing suspense before police finally returned. Empty-handed but with reassuring words, they'd found clear evidence. Someone had fled through the yard and into nearby woods. Though the intruder escaped, police now knew exactly how dangerous they'd become. My parents arrived moments later, terrified by what I'd just endured, comforting me as we spent the night in a hotel. We never slept another night in that home again. Within days we moved out permanently, haunted by memories of that terrifying experience. Weeks later, we learned through the police that a man had been arrested nearby, responsible for similar incidents in surrounding neighborhoods. His pattern was always the same, meticulously stalking homes, testing their defenses, becoming bolder until he finally forced entry. Hearing the details brought sickening clarity to just how narrowly I'd escaped that night. Though physically unharmed, the emotional scars remained deeply rooted. Trust in safety had been shattered. No matter where I lived afterward, every creak, every shadow brought back memories of hiding desperately, inches away from someone whose intentions were terrifyingly clear. The summer I turned 25, I decided to take a road trip alone, driving cross-country to see friends and visit places I'd only ever dreamed of. For weeks everything went perfectly. The freedom of being alone on the open road felt exhilarating, like nothing could possibly go wrong. After visiting several states and staying briefly with old friends, I eventually found myself in a remote part of northern Michigan, driving through quiet towns and endless stretches of forest. I loved the calm, peaceful landscapes, but they soon gave way to an uneasy sense of isolation. The roads became narrower, towns became smaller and fewer, and my cell phone signal frequently disappeared for hours at a time. One evening, after a long day of driving, Exhaustion began to weigh heavily on me. I checked my phone for a nearby hotel or motel, but it displayed no service. Deciding to push on, I drove until just after sunset when, to my relief, I spotted a small roadside motel, seemingly in the middle of nowhere. It was old and worn down, but the vacancy sign glowed invitingly. Pulling into the empty parking lot, I noticed only 2 other cars parked near the office. Inside, the lobby was dimly lit, dusty, and smelled faintly of mildew. A single man stood behind the counter, watching me carefully as I approached. He was tall, probably in his mid-40s, with thinning hair and dark circles beneath his eyes, as if he hadn't slept properly in days. His eyes were unsettling, intense, almost emotionless. I asked for a room for one night, paying in cash since their credit card readers seemed broken. He silently handed me an old-fashioned metal key, his fingers lingering on it for a second too long before letting go. "Room 5, he said quietly, eyes locked onto mine. "End of the building. Enjoy your stay." Walking outside, I felt his gaze following me, sending a chill down my spine. Brushing off my unease as paranoia from being tired, I quickly entered my room and locked the door securely behind me. Inside, the room was sparse. Just a bed, a small desk, and an outdated TV. The wallpaper peeled slightly from the walls, and the air smelled stale, but I was too tired to care. After checking the door and windows again, I lay down, scrolling through pictures from my trip until exhaustion overcame me. Soon, I drifted off into a restless sleep, but something woke me hours later. A sudden sound from just outside my room. At first, I wasn't sure exactly what it was. Perhaps another guest arriving late, I reasoned, but I felt instantly uneasy. Minutes later, I heard it again, a faint scratching noise near my door, like someone slowly dragging something metallic across wood. My heart immediately started racing, a tight knot forming in my stomach. Carefully, silently, I got out of bed, stepping toward the door. My breathing quickened as I looked through the peephole, but saw only darkness. Convinced it might be a stray animal, I stepped away, but suddenly, a shadow passed beneath the small crack at the bottom of my door. Someone was standing directly outside my room, not moving, just waiting quietly. My entire body tensed, adrenaline surging through me. What were they doing? Several tense seconds passed. Then I heard footsteps slowly moving away, disappearing into silence. I stood there frozen for minutes, barely daring to breathe, waiting to hear anything else. But there was nothing. Eventually, exhaustion and confusion overcame fear, and I convinced myself it must have been another guest, mistaking their room for mine. I got back into bed, but my mind refused to let me relax. Sleep seemed impossible now, anxiety gnawing at every thought. Just as I finally felt myself drifting off again, another sound broke through the silence, louder this time. A slow knocking at my door, 3 deliberate taps. Terrified, I sat up, heart pounding violently. Silence followed. Then came 3 more knocks, louder now, insistent. A voice spoke softly from outside the door, barely above a whisper. "Miss, you awake in there? Just checking up on you." My blood turned to ice instantly. It was clearly the man from the front desk. Why would he be checking on me at nearly 3 in the morning? Every instinct screamed that something was horribly wrong. I stayed completely silent, holding my breath. "I saw your light on," he continued softly, calmly. "Just wanted to make sure you're all right." I glanced around desperately, noticing for the first time how isolated my room felt. No other lights, no other sounds, no one around to hear me if I called for help. Seconds later, the handle of my door slowly twisted, gently at first, then harder. My entire body shook with fear as I realized he was trying to open it. The door handle rattled louder now. As he spoke again, his voice colder this time. "I know you're awake in there. Open up. It's safer that way." I grabbed my phone, panicking as I realized there was still no service. Trapped, helpless, I knew I had only moments to act. Racing to the window at the back of my room, I threw open the curtains, desperately hoping for another way out. But instead, I saw something far more chilling. Standing there in the darkness, just feet from the glass, was another figure, someone else, waiting quietly outside, staring straight into my window. Their face was hidden by a mask, illuminated dimly by the faint glow of a nearby streetlight. My pulse skyrocketed, my body paralyzed with fear. I suddenly realized I wasn't just dealing with one man at the door. There were multiple people surrounding me, waiting patiently outside my room. At that terrifying moment, trapped inside that isolated motel room, it became horribly clear. The small quiet place I'd chosen to stop for the night wasn't safe at all. It was a trap, designed to lure unsuspecting travelers like me into something far darker than I'd ever imagined possible. Fear surged through me like electricity, paralyzing every muscle as I stared helplessly at the masked figure outside my window. They stood perfectly still, their head tilted slightly, just watching. Behind me, the doorknob rattled louder, the man's voice becoming impatient. "Just open the door," he hissed softly. "This can be easy if you cooperate." My mind raced frantically, desperate to find an escape, trapped between the front door and the masked stranger outside my window. Every exit seemed hopelessly blocked. Instinctively, I moved into the tiny bathroom, locking that door behind me as an extra barrier. Shaking uncontrollably, I searched again for phone signal, but there was still nothing, just a lifeless screen mocking my isolation. Seconds later, I heard the sickening crack of wood splintering. The door to my room had been forced open. Footsteps entered slowly, deliberately pacing through the room. The intruder moved calmly, seemingly unconcerned, as if confident I had no escape. "Where'd you go?" he murmured quietly, voice filled with mock concern. "It's late, dangerous out here. Let me help you." My breathing came in short, panicked gasps. I frantically searched the bathroom for anything that might help me. A weapon, a way out, anything. I grabbed a small pair of scissors from a toiletry bag and clutched them tightly in trembling fingers. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The footsteps stopped outside the bathroom door. My heart hammered violently in my chest. He spoke again, softly, calmly. "You can't stay in there forever," he whispered quietly, almost gently. "Eventually, you'll have to come out." I stayed frozen, tears of fear streaming silently down my face. My grip tightened around the scissors, desperately hoping the man would lose interest and leave. But he didn't. He waited patiently, breathing softly just inches away. Then, to my horror, I heard more footsteps entering the room from outside. The masked figure at the window had come in, joining the first intruder. I realized with sickening certainty that I'd walked straight into something horrific, a carefully planned trap. They'd probably done this before, preying on isolated travelers who no one would immediately miss. Time seemed frozen as silence filled the room, punctuated only by my terrified breaths. Then, a sudden loud knocking at the door to the motel room next to mine broke the silence. A gruff voice shouted, irritated, "What's all the noise? People are trying to sleep." The intruders paused abruptly. For the first time, hesitation filled the air. My heart lifted slightly. Someone else was nearby. Another voice, another witness. Gathering courage, I screamed as loudly as I could, desperate for help. "Please, call the police. They're trying to hurt me." For a split second, everything stood still. Then I heard frantic footsteps retreating rapidly from my room, doors slamming open and shut as the intruders fled into the night. My breath caught painfully, relief flooding through me as I realized I'd been saved, at least for now. Moments later, the neighbor from the next room, a large older man, pounded on my motel door. "Are you okay? I already called the cops," he shouted urgently. I cautiously opened the bathroom door, stepping shakily into the wreckage of my room. Relief washed over me when I saw his concerned face. I quickly explained what had happened, my voice shaking violently. Police arrived swiftly, searching the motel grounds and interviewing the front desk clerk, who had returned during the commotion. But the man who had checked me in earlier, the man who had calmly tried forcing his way into my room, was gone, vanished completely into the night. His accomplice, the masked figure at the window, had also disappeared, leaving behind no obvious clues to their identities. The police later revealed something deeply unsettling. This wasn't an isolated incident. Similar attacks had occurred previously in this region, always targeting travelers in remote locations. They explained grimly that I'd been extremely lucky. The presence of the neighbor, awakened by the noise, had likely saved my life. Shaken to my core, I left immediately, driving straight through the night, desperate to put as much distance between myself and the motel as possible. But no amount of distance erased the trauma. The realization that people capable of such calculated cruelty existed everywhere haunted me deeply, shattering the comfort I'd once felt while traveling alone. Eventually, the police made an arrest weeks later, capturing the man from the motel in another county. After attempting a similar attack, he was charged and imprisoned, yet his masked accomplice was never found. The thought that someone involved remained free, anonymous, still out there watching travelers, stayed with me like a dark shadow I could never shake. Now, no matter where I travel, I never stay in isolated places. I always double-check locks, always look twice at strangers, always wonder who else might be watching silently from the shadows. The carefree spirit I once cherished was replaced by cautious vigilance, a permanent reminder that sometimes real monsters don't hide under beds or in closets. Sometimes they're smiling behind motel counters, quietly handing out keys, patiently waiting until you're alone, vulnerable, and completely unaware of the danger you're in. I was 27 when I moved to a mid-sized city, ready for a fresh start after a difficult breakup and an exhausting job search. I quickly rented a modest apartment downtown, a cozy place tucked into the second floor of a renovated building. The neighborhood felt vibrant and lively, close to trendy cafes, bookstores, and a bustling nightlife. It seemed perfect. The first few weeks went by smoothly. I settled into my routine, meeting a few neighbors who were friendly enough, but mostly kept to themselves. Occasionally I'd notice one particular neighbor, a man living across the hall named Marcus, who always seemed to linger a little too long when we crossed paths. He was quiet, shy even, with short cropped hair, glasses, and a polite yet slightly awkward smile. At first I brushed it off, assuming he was simply reserved. But after about a month, subtle things started happening. I'd come home after work to find small items around my apartment, slightly out of place. Books I'd left on the coffee table were now stacked neatly beside it. My coffee mug, which I was certain I'd left dirty in the sink, would be cleaned and carefully placed back in the cabinet. At first I questioned my memory, chalking it up to exhaustion or stress. One evening, after returning late from dinner with coworkers, I unlocked my door and stepped into my dark apartment, immediately sensing something off. The air felt heavier, as if someone had just left moments before. Uneasy, I switched on the lights, scanning the room nervously. At first glance, nothing seemed obviously wrong, but then I saw it clearly. My bedroom door stood slightly ajar, a thin sliver of darkness peeking out. I always closed that door before leaving. Heart pounding, I cautiously approached, gently pushing it open. My stomach twisted instantly in panic. My bed was perfectly made, neatly arranged with military precision, a far cry from how I'd left it. Blankets tossed aside hastily that morning. A single folded piece of paper sat carefully positioned on the pillow. With trembling fingers, I unfolded it and read the brief handwritten note. "I hope you don't mind. I just wanted to help. You deserve everything nice." My blood ran cold as I realized someone had been inside my apartment, touching my things, rearranging my life, invading my privacy. Worse, this wasn't some random break-in. It felt personal, intimate, as though the intruder genuinely believed they were helping me. Immediately, my thoughts flashed to Marcus, the odd smiles in the hallway, the lingering glances. I suddenly remembered him mentioning, in passing, that he had once been a locksmith. The realization hit like a wave of nausea. He would easily know how to get inside. Terrified and unsure of what else to do, I called the police. When they arrived, they searched my apartment carefully, finding no obvious evidence of forced entry, further confirming my suspicion that whoever had come in possessed key skills, or even had a copy of my key. They took my statement and knocked on Marcus's door across the hall. but he didn't answer. They promised to follow up, but without direct evidence, there was little they could do immediately. I spent that night awake, jumping at every sound, obsessively checking locks. My apartment no longer felt safe. It felt violated. The next morning, exhausted, I went directly to my landlord, urgently requesting the locks be changed immediately. He agreed, concerned, and promised to handle it by afternoon. When I returned later that day, new locks had been installed. Relief washed over me temporarily, until I saw Marcus standing silently in the hallway, watching me closely. His face showed no anger or guilt, just quiet disappointment, as if I'd betrayed him somehow. I hurried inside, locking the door firmly behind me, trying desperately to forget his unsettling stare. Days passed quietly afterward, my anxiety slowly easing, but one evening, as I sat reading, a quiet knock at my door broke the calm. My heart quickened instantly. Approaching cautiously, I looked through the peephole, dread tightening in my chest. Marcus stood outside, hands clasped nervously together, looking timid yet determined. "Please," he said quietly, "I just want to talk." I didn't respond, hoping he'd simply leave, but he continued, voice gentle yet deeply unsettling. "I didn't mean to frighten you. I've watched you struggle. You deserve someone who cares for you." Panic rose sharply within me. I stepped back silently, heart pounding loudly, praying he'd leave quickly. After several painfully long moments, his footsteps faded, returning to his apartment. But the relief was short-lived. I was no longer just unnerved by Marcus. I was now afraid of what he might do next. Days dragged by with constant tension. Each time I left the apartment, I scanned anxiously for him, and each night, I triple-checked my locks. My sense of security shattered completely. Then came a night that finally pushed everything too far. Returning home after grocery shopping, arms filled with bags, I noticed my apartment door slightly open again. My pulse skyrocketed instantly. Dropping the bags, I stood frozen, paralyzed with dread. How had he gotten in? I had brand new locks. How did he keep managing to invade my privacy? Hesitantly, I stepped closer, peering inside. My apartment was dimly lit, silent, yet clearly occupied. Someone was inside, moving quietly. My breath caught painfully, as I realized Marcus had grown bolder, waiting inside my apartment, calmly expecting my arrival. Just as I began stepping backward to flee, Marcus appeared suddenly in the doorway, his face gentle yet disturbingly calm. "Welcome home," he said softly, eyes unblinking behind his glasses. "I've missed you." At that moment, fear and panic overwhelmed every rational thought. I turned immediately, sprinting desperately down the hallway toward the stairs, hearing Marcus's calm voice calling after me, almost sorrowfully, "You don't have to run. I'll find you again." My heart hammered painfully against my chest. As I sprinted down the hallway, Marcus's unsettling voice echoing softly behind me. Fear fueled every desperate step. My breath sharp and ragged, I stumbled down the stairwell, nearly losing balance, my mind racing frantically. Bursting out of the building and onto the dimly lit street, I immediately dialed 911, gasping out my address and situation, pleading urgently for help. Standing on the sidewalk, I glanced nervously back toward the entrance of my apartment building, terrified Marcus would suddenly appear behind me. Within minutes, flashing police lights illuminated the street, officers quickly approaching, guns drawn as they entered my building. I watched helplessly from outside, shaking violently, anxiety clawing painfully at my chest. After what felt like an eternity, the officers re-emerged, guiding Marcus carefully from the building, hands cuffed tightly behind his back. He didn't struggle or fight. Instead, he looked toward me calmly, eyes filled with an unnerving mixture of regret and quiet determination. My skin crawled, a chill racing down my spine as he mouthed silent words. "I'll come back." Police informed me they found Marcus inside my apartment, calmly waiting as if he'd lived there for years. He had made himself disturbingly comfortable, cooking dinner in my kitchen, placing flowers on my table, arranging personal items, as if he belonged there. The revelation left me deeply sickened. The officers took me back inside briefly to retrieve belongings, but the apartment no longer felt like mine. It had been invaded, stolen by someone else's twisted fantasy. I gathered essentials hastily, refusing to spend a single extra second within those tainted walls. That night, I stayed at a friend's home, unable to stop trembling, jumping at every shadow, every unfamiliar noise. Marcus had been arrested, charged with stalking and unlawful entry, but his calm confidence haunted me. He clearly wasn't afraid of consequences, seemingly certain he'd eventually return to finish whatever he'd started. Days passed uneasily as I desperately searched for a new apartment. Everywhere I went, paranoia followed closely behind. Crowded streets felt threatening. Empty hallways terrified me. Marcus's words lingered endlessly. "I'll find you again." No amount of reassurance from police or friends quieted my fear completely. Eventually I settled into another apartment miles away, hoping distance would grant me peace. For weeks things stayed quiet, anxiety gradually fading, allowing small comforts to return. But just when I began feeling safe again, a sudden phone call late one evening shattered everything. The caller was unknown, breathing softly into the phone before speaking gently, chillingly familiar. "Did you think I wouldn't find you? I told you, you're mine." Marcus's voice sent ice racing through my veins, the safety I'd briefly felt evaporating instantly. I immediately contacted police, who traced the call to a public payphone. Marcus had been released on bail, awaiting trial, and had clearly wasted no time returning to torment me. My life descended into constant fear again. Police advised me to relocate temporarily, stay vigilant, and remain hidden while they attempted to locate Marcus once more. I moved frequently, constantly looking over my shoulder, convinced every shadow concealed him. Friends offered shelter, but no place felt truly safe. Marcus seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once, patiently stalking, carefully watching, always waiting for the right moment to strike. Then, one rainy night weeks later, while staying alone at a small motel outside town, my worst nightmare returned. Just as I'd finally relaxed enough to sleep, a soft knocking startled me awake. Immediately I knew it was him. My heart thundered as I silently grabbed my phone, whispering urgently to the dispatcher that Marcus had found me again. As I waited in panic for police, Marcus's voice whispered softly from outside the motel door. "Please, just open up. This is exhausting for both of us. You can't hide forever." I trembled violently, gripping a small pocket knife I'd carried everywhere since he'd first appeared in my life. Seconds dragged painfully by, each knock growing louder, more impatient. Finally, sirens pierced the tense silence outside, lights illuminating my window. Marcus fled instantly, footsteps fading quickly into the darkness. Police searched relentlessly, eventually finding Marcus hiding nearby. This time they held him securely without bail, pressing charges of stalking, harassment and threats. I felt momentarily safer, but the emotional damage was permanent. Trust in others, trust in security, completely destroyed. Marcus was sentenced months later, imprisoned securely, yet despite his confinement, the trauma remained. Every quiet moment brought memories flooding back. His calm voice, the careful invasions of my privacy, his gentle yet chilling insistence that I belonged to him. Moving forward felt impossible, his threats permanently altering how I viewed the world around me. Years later, even knowing Marcus was securely locked away, paranoia lingered quietly in the background of my life. Every stranger received wary glances, every shadow brought fresh anxiety. Safety no longer felt guaranteed anywhere. Isolation had become an enemy. Solitude turned into vulnerability. Marcus had succeeded in stealing something irreplaceable. Not my belongings or even physical safety, but the peace of mind I'd once taken for granted. His quiet words never fully disappeared, lingering faintly in quiet moments. A constant reminder that sometimes the most terrifying threats don't arrive loudly or violently. They slip quietly into your life, patiently invading every corner until there's nowhere left to hide. I was 29 when I accepted a position as a caretaker for an estate on the outskirts of a small, sleepy town in Pennsylvania. The property belonged to an elderly widow named Margaret Finch, who had recently moved into a care facility, leaving her expansive but isolated home empty. My job was straightforward: keep the house clean, maintain the grounds, and occasionally prepare the place if her family or real estate agents wanted to visit. The property itself was stunning but isolated, nestled deep among tall trees that cast long shadows across the sprawling lawns. The home was old and grand, built nearly a century earlier, with beautiful architecture and countless rooms filled with vintage furniture. But there was something unsettling about it too. A loneliness permeated the hallways, a heavy quiet that seemed oppressive rather than peaceful. The first few days passed uneventfully. My routine quickly became comfortable. Mornings cleaning inside, afternoons spent maintaining the gardens or lawn. But within a week, odd occurrences started to interrupt the calm. Nothing obvious at first, just subtle disturbances, easily dismissed as quirks of an old house. Doors I was sure I'd shut firmly were found slightly ajar, and curtains I'd left drawn were open again upon my return. Initially, I blamed myself, attributing it to distraction, or simply adjusting to a new place. But soon the disturbances grew harder to ignore. Items went missing only to turn up again, days later in completely different rooms. Once, a book I'd left on the coffee table appeared neatly placed on the pillow of the master bedroom upstairs, a room I rarely entered. The unsettling feelings deepened. I'd catch myself looking over my shoulder frequently, sensing eyes watching from shadowy corners, or from behind the towering trees outside. The isolation of the property, once peaceful, now felt threatening. One afternoon, while organizing boxes in the basement, I stumbled upon something that sent chills racing down my spine. A pile of photographs tucked neatly inside an old suitcase. They appeared recent, capturing various angles of the estate, including shots clearly taken from inside the trees surrounding the property. My heart pounded heavily as I flipped through the stack. The last few photos were different, focused closely on windows of the home, windows belonging to rooms I'd occupied. My pulse quickened painfully. Someone had been watching me carefully, quietly, deliberately, taking pictures without my knowledge. Panic surged within me. Who was watching, and why? I immediately called the agency that had hired me, explaining what I'd discovered, hoping for reassurance or answers. Instead, they seemed startled, confused. Margaret Finch hadn't authorized anyone else to access the property. They suggested I report it to the local police, so I did, reluctantly calling and describing everything I'd found. The officers who arrived later were polite, but skeptical. They took my statement and examined the photos carefully, agreeing they were troubling, but offering no immediate explanations. They searched the estate thoroughly, but found nothing suspicious, assuring me they'd increase patrols nearby. Still, their lack of urgency left me deeply unsettled. Days passed anxiously. Each moment alone felt tense, every sound magnified by fear. I found myself double-checking locks obsessively, glancing nervously toward windows, convinced unseen eyes lingered just beyond the curtains. The once beautiful estate felt transformed, no longer safe or welcoming. Then, late one evening, everything escalated sharply. A storm had blown in, heavy rain battering the old roof, wind howling relentlessly outside. I'd been sitting alone in the living room, reading nervously, when suddenly, the lights flickered and went out entirely, plunging the house into absolute darkness. My pulse skyrocketed instantly. Cursing softly, I reached for my phone, turning on the flashlight. Slowly, I moved toward the basement to check the breaker box. Every creak of the floorboards echoed through the darkened halls, heightening my anxiety. Descending cautiously, I reached the basement and opened the metal door leading to the breakers, flipping switches until finally the lights flickered back on. Relief flooded me briefly, until I heard something else, a sound above me, distinct and horrifyingly clear. Heavy footsteps moving slowly across the floor upstairs. My breath caught painfully, heart pounding rapidly in panic. Someone was inside the house, frozen, unsure what to do. I listened carefully. The footsteps continued, pacing calmly, unhurried. Who had managed to enter, and how? Grabbing a nearby hammer from the shelf beside me, I slowly climbed the basement steps again, praying my trembling legs wouldn't fail me. Peering cautiously around the corner at the top of the stairs, I glanced down the dim hallway toward the living room, my entire body rigid with dread. At first I saw nothing, just shadows and furniture illuminated weakly by distant lightning flashes. But then movement caught my eye, subtle yet terrifyingly real. Someone was standing quietly by the living room window, watching silently, motionless, heart pounding painfully. I ducked quickly out of sight. Who were they? And why were they here? I reached immediately for my phone, dialing 911 again, whispering urgently that someone had broken in. The dispatcher assured me police were en route, advising me to hide and remain silent. Crouching in the shadows of the hallway, gripping the hammer tightly, I listened as the intruder moved calmly through the living room, footsteps slow, deliberate, unafraid. Their calmness terrified me even more. This wasn't some random burglary. It felt purposeful, calculated. A sudden thought struck me painfully. The photos I'd found, the hidden surveillance. This intruder had been watching and planning for days, perhaps weeks, waiting patiently for this very moment. Moments passed painfully slow, each second magnified by fear. Eventually, I heard the intruder moving again, footsteps drawing closer toward the hallway, where I crouched hidden. My grip tightened desperately on the hammer. This was it, the moment I'd feared most. Someone who'd meticulously studied my every move was now only steps away, carefully searching for me in the darkness. My breath caught painfully in my throat as the footsteps came closer, steady and calm, drawing deliberately nearer to my hiding place. I squeezed the hammer tightly, knuckles aching, heart slamming violently against my ribs. Whoever this was, they knew exactly what they were doing. There was no hesitation, no confusion, only quiet confidence as they approached. The footsteps paused abruptly, mere inches away, just around the corner from where I hid. Silence stretched unbearably, broken only by the muffled sounds of the storm still raging outside. I fought desperately to remain still, holding my breath, praying the intruder couldn't hear the terrified hammering of my pulse. Suddenly, a voice shattered the tense silence. A man's voice, calm yet unsettlingly detached. "I know you're right there," he whispered gently, almost casually. "You've been very careful, but I've watched you closely, every single day." His words sent chills crawling down my spine. He spoke with chilling familiarity, like someone who knew me intimately. Despite never having met, my mind raced frantically. Was this person connected to Margaret Finch, a former caretaker, or someone who had secretly observed the estate for years? "Why are you hiding?" he continued softly, a sinister edge creeping into his voice. "We could have met before tonight, if you weren't always so cautious." Terrified, I stayed silent, refusing to respond, hoping desperately police were close. But he pressed on, voice low and insistent. "I've seen everything. Your routines, the rooms you favor, even how you fold laundry in the evenings. You made it so easy." The realization hit me sickeningly. This wasn't random. I'd become someone's twisted obsession, a target chosen simply because of the job I'd taken. Panic surged through me, adrenaline sharpening my senses, painfully. I had to escape. Suddenly, headlights cut through the darkness, blue lights flashing faintly through the curtains. Police had arrived. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by dread. The intruder also noticed, muttering softly under his breath, footsteps quickly retreating deeper into the house. I stood quickly, legs trembling, calling out loudly for help. As the front door burst open, and officers rushed inside, they swept the property swiftly, eventually discovering the intruder hiding in an upstairs closet. Officers escorted him out firmly, hands cuffed behind his back. As they passed me, our eyes briefly met, and my blood went cold. His gaze held no fear or remorse, only quiet intensity and disturbing confidence. He spoke softly as he walked past. "I'll see you again." Police later revealed his identity. His name was Daniel Fletcher, a former employee of the estate who had been dismissed years earlier due to his increasingly erratic and obsessive behavior toward Margaret Finch. Since then, he'd lived quietly in town, waiting, planning, obsessively fixated on whoever occupied the property. I'd unknowingly become his new target, and he'd spent weeks silently watching me, meticulously planning this moment. Though Daniel was charged and taken into custody, the ordeal haunted me deeply. I resigned immediately, leaving the estate and moving far away, hoping distance would erase the trauma. But no matter how far I traveled, the memory of Daniel's quiet confidence, his chilling words, and the feeling of being constantly watched stayed burned into my mind. Months passed. I found a new home, attempted to rebuild some sense of normalcy, yet anxiety lingered. I often woke at night, convinced I heard footsteps outside my bedroom, whispers in the dark corners. Friends assured me it was just trauma, paranoia from past events, but the sense of being watched never fully disappeared. Then one evening, nearly a year later, while walking home from dinner, I felt it again, a familiar sense of eyes following closely behind. My pulse quickened sharply, unease tightening painfully in my chest. Glancing nervously over my shoulder, my heart nearly stopped. Daniel stood calmly across the street, watching silently beneath a dim streetlight. My blood froze instantly. He'd somehow been released. No one had notified me. Our eyes locked briefly. A small cold smile crossed his face before he stepped back into the shadows, disappearing instantly. Terrified, I hurried home, immediately calling the police. Desperate for answers, they confirmed grimly Daniel had been quietly released, due to lack of strong evidence against him. They assured me they'd watch closely, but their words brought little comfort. Daniel had found me once, and clearly had no trouble finding me again. Weeks of anxious vigilance followed. Each day felt exhausting. Every shadow held potential threats. Daniel seemed to disappear again entirely, yet his brief reappearance had permanently shattered my fragile sense of security. Then came a night that finally proved my worst fears true. As I climbed into bed, exhausted from constant worry, my phone buzzed softly. An unknown number had sent a text message, simple yet horrifyingly clear. "You've settled in nicely. Your new home suits you." My pulse thundered violently, as fear washed over me completely. Daniel was watching again, patiently waiting, determined not to let me escape this time. Police responded immediately to my frantic call, searching carefully, yet found no trace of him nearby. Unable to stay another night alone, I packed quickly, fleeing the city entirely, determined never again to leave myself vulnerable. But no matter where I traveled, paranoia followed closely, always wondering if Daniel was quietly tracking my movements, silently observing from shadows. His threats had deeply scarred my life, permanently destroying trust in safety or security. Months became years. Eventually, police contacted me, finally revealing Daniel had been arrested again, after another terrifying incident involving a different victim. Though securely imprisoned now, the damage had been done. The knowledge that I'd narrowly escaped Daniel's dark obsession haunted me relentlessly. I learned through bitter experience that true terror rarely lies in shadows or ghost stories. It's often hidden quietly among ordinary people, watching patiently, waiting silently for the perfect moment to step forward and turn your entire life into an endless nightmare.